Well, hola, ladies and gentlemen of Biology 11, and here we go with another edition of our in-class show, specifically Phylum Arthropoda. When I say Arthropoda, I hope you think things like lobsters, insects, spiders, arachnids, ticks, and what all of these things have in common, what's very unifying, is we say they're arthropods. In other words, they have an exoskeleton, and kind of like any soldier who's wearing armor, what they have to do in order to be able to make that work is to have joints in their armor. So arthropoda literally means jointed foot. Some people say jointed leg, but imagine somebody in a suit of armor, and as if that was their skeleton, that's what we're talking about. Shrimp, crustaceans, like shrimp, crab, lobsters, etc. They all fit into this group. It is a very large group. And this is what we need to study, so I guess we got a lot of work to do. So let's get going. Okay, so in addition to the in-class resources, we'll go through a quick slideshow. Again, there's great YouTube videos, etc., that I want you to check out, animations, but it's my job to pretty well walk you through and for you to absorb, I guess, all this information about arthropods. A lot of diversity here. In fact, you could almost look at the arthropods as being the reason why the vertebrates on our planet are totally outnumbered. Let's think about this. Things with a rod up their back. Now, more primitively, I'll call that a chordate. But if you think about things that have a rod up their back, you might think of cats, dogs, cows, humans, etc. But in the animal kingdom, that's a minority. That's maybe 1 in 5 critters. When you think about the other side of the equation, the invertebrates, something without a rod running up their spine, just to be simple, that's 95% of the enchilada. That's a lot. Cockroaches, caterpillars, beetles, and insects are a huge group, well, grouping within the arthropods that were very successful in inhabiting and taking over sort of this thing we call land. Here we go. So again, to be an arthropod, let's just define that. Be clear. Comes from two words, arthro and poda. Arthro, if you think of arthritis, that's a pain in your joints. So we actually say that this is jointed. And poda, foot. The last time you heard something along the lines of pod would have been back probably around chapter 20 when we were talking about the pseudopods of amoeba. These little feeties that go off like this, right? Those little things right there. That's what we were talking about with reference to the term poda. And you think about a foot doctor is known as a podiatrist. So you've heard these terms before. So arthropods have a segmented body, tough exoskeleton, and all those little appendages, every single one of their movable parts has to have, if this is their, if you think about their legs coming down, you literally need to make sort of like little articulation joints so that they can flex, right? They need something like that in between. And armor is much the same way. The exoskeleton that they're using is composed of an interesting material. We see it at use in the cell walls of fungi, and this is called chitin. There we go. So their exoskeleton it's an interesting sort of a carbohydrate that they use, and it not only makes them more waterproof, but it gives their muscles something to hold on to. It's just a little different than us. Their muscles have to hold on to their skeleton, which is on the outside, where with us, our muscles are applied to a skeleton which is on the inside. So many critters here, many creepy crawlies for you to look at. Few terms, we already hit this. Chitinous exoskeleton, that's a carbohydrate, so we can cruise through this material pretty quickly. Nothing new here. If you need to, hit pause now, so if you have something you want to write down. Otherwise, I'll just kind of move on. When they talk about jointed appendages, the nearest way I can demonstrate this to you, if you think of a crab claw, think of that. They're not only jointed, which means there's a little division in there so that they can move. Each of their appendages extend out from the body wall, and their appendages are covered in this hard chitinous exoskeleton. Well, I guess I shouldn't say hard. It's a relatively stiff material, although it can be quite flexible. Depends on on how thick it is. It covers every single body part, legs, antennae, pretty well everything, like I say. Arthropods are important in evolution because it was the arthropods that really took over just about every environmental niche you can imagine. They were very effective at invading land, and their bodies were very waterproof, so they were able to come up on land. And if you ever see fish jump out of water at going after bugs and things like that, it was definitely a motivating force for animals on our planet to invade land when the arthropods had already invaded land. The food source was sort of over there. So it was sort of a pulling trend in evolution, an incentive, if you will. If the food went on land, other things were bound to come up on land. And think of things that move past sort of concepts, critters on our planet like fish. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. Why did they come on land? What were they after? Well, we see fish jumping out of the water, so there's your first hint. Arthropod evolution not only made land-based evolution just much more feasible, just that much more appetizing, but arthropods are incredibly adept in just about any environment. We know in the water, a couple of arthropods you might know. You've got crabs, lobsters. Heck, you watch water bugs skip along the surface, right? Shrimp, they're arthropods. These neat little critters, they're kind of land-based critters. We call them isopods, but they largely came from these three camps. Pillbug, we'll talk about them later. I haven't talked about trilobites since the beginning of the course, but trilobites are important because they demonstrate a pretty important truth, that segmentation in evolution was really an early concept mastered by arthropods. As you set up different segments in your body, in this case, they more or less have just you can see these fine segmentations here. What it suggests is that the body's starting to be compartmentalized into important little regions, and each of those regions is starting to get a job. Now, as the segments formed, the different regions of the body, as I say, got different roles. If you think about this segment up here, really what you have is sort of a head thorax region, but you start to see it beginning to develop here. This region and this region become different spots in the body to take on, well, in an insect you might see a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and in a spider you might just see sort of like a head with no neck, a cephalothorax, and an abdomen. But the different parts of the body do different things, and the head begins to form its own region. It starts to get sensory input, and that is inevitable in nature. There was this march towards more complicated design, but the parts of the body had to be put in different compartments. If you look at us, for example, we're much like this. We have our head has a brain and many sensors poked around it. In our thorax, if you beat on your chest, you'll find a set of lungs and a heart in there. And then our abdomen really became a digestive region. We are very compartmentalized, and it started with segmentation, dividing the body into different regions. Just that our arthropod relatives got this ball rolling very efficiently. Trilobite, if you wanted to see one, by the way, let's see here. Just talking about trilobites the other day. You'd find them just offshore. In fact, they were a very shallow water critter, much like today's horseshoe crab. So we find their fossils all over the place. That's why we say they're an index fossil. There we go. What we believe they looked like. Definitely a head region, a thorax, and kind of what looks like to be a third segment off the back. There they are, cruising around, having a good little conversation. Now these trilobites are neat. Shallow water critters, they were all over the place, very successful. Probably little detrivores, probably ate just about anything they came across. Interestingly enough, they look a lot like horseshoe crabs. There we go, horseshoe crab in the modern era. And it's kind of startling when you look at them. Here's a little horseshoe crab. You should never mess with these guys, right? When you look at the underside of a horseshoe crab, you start to see that there's little legs under there, almost like a little lobster running around. There's a horseshoe crab turned upside down. Dead horseshoe crab, cruising around on the beach, looking for food, mating. You get the idea. Sort of like the modern version of a trilobite. Pretty cool looking little critter, hey? The body plan of arthropods started to specialize. I'd like to say that the no-neck version, the one that just had a cephal region and the head and the thorax, we call that the cephalothorax, that's kind of primitive. You see that in spiders, and you see that in crabs, and you see that in lobsters. Body segments were really undergoing a lot of metamorphosis, if you think about it this way. Sort of, if you step back, body segments were coming together. Sometimes they were fusing, sometimes they were differentiating. An ant, for example, has a well-developed head region, but compared to a crab, it's like the crab has no neck. And we call what a crab has a cephalothorax. It doesn't really have a distinct head from its, basically from the main part of its body. So arthropods were evolving, and we started to see fewer of those finer segments. What you saw, lots of those little segments we saw with the trilobites. And eventually we just kind of got down to something along the lines of what you'd see with an insect, right? With the head, and then the thorax, and then the abdomen, and then the legs coming off. Like that. Instead of being complicated like the trilobite was. Lots of little individual segments. That was a little bit of a pain. Complex organ systems were kind of inevitable because we were starting to develop something like a circulatory system. And on board comes the brain. Then we develop systems to remove toxins from our blood. So every one of the major systems was developing and started working together, which is why we call them organ systems. So in us, an example of that is our lungs work with our heart. That's coordinated with our nervous system. And this is what animals really are all about. This is an advantage, but it was a tremendous challenge too, was to develop coordination between all these systems. They had to be interrelated, and they made a good point of pointing that out down here. So if we look at something which is more or less, what are we examining for the digestive system? So again, I'm going to write that in, as in previous chat sessions. what do these things eat? What are they all about? Sort of step back. Well, we've got ones, if you think about locusts and things like that, definitely see that we have herbivores. We have carnivorous ones. If you look at some of the critters out there, if you look at spiders, for example, weave you into a cocoon, give you the poisonous death bite and suck you dry. That makes sense. We see parasitic forms, right? We think of the mosquito. Mosquito's definitely a parasite. Ticks, all sorts of wonderful little things, right? But as there's so many forms to go over, we couldn't possibly go through them in one session, but just about everything is represented here. Detrivores, parasites, filter feeders, lots of basically like food niches that are occupied. They occupy all of them. Remember that detrivores is pretty well just something that's dead or decaying, and something comes along and eats it. Okay, so we don't really say that's not really being a carnivore or being a parasite. The thing was dead already when they found it. And it's neat when you look at the mouth parts of different arthropods, because they're very much adapted to the way the arthropod eats. And I don't think that's gonna. Before I move on, let's look at fly mouth parts, because you just have to reinforce this concept. The mouth parts of a fly, you realize that what a fly does is it barfs up a bit of digestive enzyme like juice, and then it uses, basically it's like almost like a big straw. It's kind of gross with lips on the end. They barf up on their food and the enzymes digest it, and then they slurp it up. So they digest it externally, right? And that's their design. But when you look at the mouth parts of different things, if you look at a moth and you consider what moths and butterflies and things will do, they have mouth parts that are adapted. This piece down here, this curled piece, is adapted so that they can drink, for example, like flower nectar, and they can get that down into the flower, and it helps them to survive. I like it. It should be called for what it is. It's a proboscis. Now, if you think biological coloring is tough in my class, imagine what it would be like in an entomology class with insects, where you had to know all the little bits. Let's look at spider mouth parts. A spider's adapted to sting you. It's got basically a fang, and they're called chelicerates for that reason, and they will bite you. Let's see if we can find it here. Just want a nice simple one. Here we go. They'll bite you with that green region right there, called as chelicera or fang, and they might have poison glands to overwhelm you, so that they can eat you more easily. And their mouth parts are adapted for their hunting strategy. These are definite predators, right? Carnivores. And this is kind of more or less how they do business. So, just showed you a few. But a mosquito, for example, needle-like mouth part, right? Proboscis. I think you're getting the idea that their bodies have adapted to the way they feed. Sounds a little bit like evolution, doesn't it? So how might they respire? By that, remember, how do they get their O2 in and get their CO2 out? I always love to show a grasshopper as an example, because what a grasshopper has, now you know that we have a trachea, it's that lumpy bumpy thing in your throat, but grasshoppers actually have right here, here, and here, these little tracheal tubes that go in, that are the exchange sites for gases. And if you follow this, if I make a purple sort of line moving up, you can see that tube system runs throughout the organism and helps to basically allow oxygen gas into the blood and carbon dioxide gas out. So this is the exchange site. So unlike us, they're not breathing through their mouth. This grasshopper, you could hold its head underwater, and as long as its abdomen is exposed to the air, our friend here could never drown, because respiration has nothing to do with its mouth. It's breathing, if you will, through its sides. Here you go. It's an even better picture of it. This is its respiratory strategy right here. And those fine little divisions are increasing the surface area so that the oxygen can get to the blood. Very, very nifty little strategy, hey? So now I can zoom out. So a series of what we call tracheal tubes. You don't expect it to have lungs. It's not developed like us. It's not that advanced. And these tracheal tubes, really, when we look at the outside, they sort of spiral a little bit. So what we call them, these little spots on the outside, let's see if I can get to mark up, are spiracles. So the air kind of, I always remembered this way, spirals in through those little tubes there. So the external part, the access point, we call the spiracles. And the spiracles lead into the extended tube system known as tracheal tubes. So I'll do a little bit of highlighting, you'll do a little bit of writing. Okay. So the air entry point is the spiracles, and these are small openings along the side of the body. Voila, done. So this takes care kind of their respiratory system. Okay, good. Now, not everything has those little tracheal tubes. You look on the side of something like a spider and you're like, well, where's the little holes? Well, interestingly enough, as you come up onto land, in evolution, there were some critters that had primitive lung-like tissue. Now, spiders didn't go back into the water, and we find a neat little bit of evidence that gill tissue began to give rise to lung tissue. If you look right here in spiders, you see a lung that has characteristics of gills. So as the air comes into kind of in through the side, you say, well, what the heck is this? This looks like the lamellar tissue or the gill tissue of a fish, but it's more like a sac that represents a lung. And because it has these little folds like this, which very much resemble gill tissue, we look at that and we say, wait a minute, that whole structure is together like a lung. So the air goes into the lung, oxygen rich, and oxygen deficient CO2 is coming out. Oh wow, that's sort of like the formation of primitive lung tissue. Spiders have lungs? They do. They have lungs that kind of have gill-like characteristics. That's some pretty neat stuff. It's important because what you're starting to see are layers of tissue, layers of respiratory tissue, and those layers are coming together and they're making a more complicated structure, which is an organ. And in this case, kind of got little folds, so we call it a book lung. So when you take tissues like this and you build them up, that's how you get organs. And wow, I mean, whoa, here it goes. We're seeing the origin of lung tissue, which is coming together to form lungs. Very cool. So these book gills are fairly prevalent. You see them in horseshoe crabs. And the gill-like tissue that we had previously seen from something aquatic, if you look at the gills of a spider's more distant ancestor, so we'll look at gills of a lobster. I'll show you where these are. Kind of coming up a little early, but why the heck not? The gills of a lobster, if you've ever pulled the legs off of a lobster, you'll get a little bit of feathery tissue kind of attached to the leg, and you wonder what that is. There we go. The gills in a lobster are kind of right underneath this part of the carapace. So they're right there, so the water is entering in through these tubes, and when you pull the legs off, you'll get a little bit of this gill tissue. Let's see if I can find it nicely. Not bad, not quite what I wanted. There we go. And as he's pulling it off, there's a bit of feathery tissue. And I remember looking at that thinking, oh, well, that's not no good. That's not any good. I'm not going to eat that. But what you're pulling off, you can see the gill tissue in the folds, right? Along here, this is a really good representation of it. And they kind of look like feathers. And it was due, very much due, to come together where they would touch and form a book lung. So, gills gave rise to lungs. No shocker there, really. Circulatory system of an arthropod is, well, let's go back to some of their relatives. We saw an open circulatory system in the mollusks. I mean, it came up. It's not a good idea. Well, specifically, you see it a lot in the bivalves, right? Clams and things like that. An open circulatory system means that the blood is being pumped around the body, but it's not always in a blood vessel. Well, you can spray or pump the blood, I guess, over the organs in something like an arthropod. It'll drain back into a sinus, and then that will flow back into another series of tubes, and it continually sort of get pumped around. And this works really well, as it turns out, in the arthropods. They have an exoskeleton. They're not going to lose any blood. It's not going anywhere. So let's switch this up. There are times where it's in things like an artery, and there's times where it's not. It's just being pooled over the organs. We should look at this. You have to understand the idea of a heart in this case. It isn't like they just have one. Each of these little bumps here are blood vessels that can squeeze just like a heart. So the blood can circulate around the body as these squeeze and keep it flowing in just more or less one direction. So they finally got around to saying the blood sometimes moves through a sinus or through a cavity, and it's not in a tube. Okay, that's what makes it open. And as it pools into the sinus like a drainage spout, it re-enters the closed circulatory system for a time, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. To be pumped around by that heart one more time. You could say that it has a series of hearts, our little friend up there, because many are doing the job of what in an advanced organism would be just one heart. All right, moving on to the excretory system. What do they have for something like kidney tissue? Okay, in the back of your mind, when I say excretory system, I know you're thinking kidney, right? Waste removal. Now the question is from what? Waste removal. Let's make that a little better. From the blood. So we've got to get that waste material out of there, and they consume a lot of protein. Think about a spider, for example. It's a predator. It pretty well just eats other organisms. So how do you get the nitrogenous protein-like waste out? Well, they've got these neat little things called malpighian tubules, and I'll show you what those look like, but you should highlight these. If I say kidney tissue, you say malpighian tubules. And here they are. First thing I'm going to point out, this is critical, so I'm moving to a black pen. This thing is not the malpighian tubules. Okay, that's like a little bit of extra digestive area, okay, up there called the gastric ceca. Okay, this is not what you're looking at. What you want to find, what you should be focused in on, it's further south here, and it's got these lots of these fine little snaky arms. I'll just undo that so you won't miss it. That is the malpighian tubules, and really what it is, it's tissue that can process the blood and remove ammonia-like waste. Okay, so put a little star by this. Whoop. And remember, it's further down than you think. This thing, the gastric ceca, looks a little bit like a starfish. It's up by the digestive system. You have to go south of that to find the malpighian tubules. And we'll look at that in the dissection in class. So the wastes that are being extracted, here we go, extracting wastes such as ammonia, NH3, ammonium, NH4+, from the blood, amongst other things. But those are some big ones that I wanted to mention. Getting toxins out of the blood. Interestingly enough, if you're in the water, let's draw a little happy face bug. Neat thing about the water is it's fairly dilute. Now, being underwater, because the water is more dilute, it's easy for things like ammonia waste and ammonia, NH3, to flow out of your concentrated body out into the less concentrated environment here. Oops. So there's a natural tendency for the waste to float. As long as you're sort of an aquatic arthropod, life's easy. The waste products are just flowing out. This happens with fish, where a certain amount, they lose a lot of their carbon dioxide out their tails, for example. Carbon dioxide is a waste product, and it just passes out of their tails because the water isn't as concentrated for carbon dioxide as the body is. It's very handy. Just let it flow out of you. That's another way to do it. As far as response goes, you should put a little note here and call this the nervous system. So what have these guys got for a nervous system? How can they sense and respond to their environment? Well, when we look back to the mollusks, look at octopi with their advanced eyes, and even an earthworm has a primitive brain, ganglia. That's what we're talking about. A cluster of nerves that come together for a common purpose in this region. There we go. Right here. And what we're talking about is a ganglion. And then there's, if you follow the blue, right, here's some more ganglia. And I'll just highlight each of them. Coordinating body activities, making this a more efficient kind of critter, because it's not only sensing its environment, it's hunting things, it's avoiding things. So a pretty good nervous system overall, and nerves and nerve clusters that pass along. So it does have a brain. Ooh, here we go. It does have a brain, and it does have nerve clusters called ganglia. And ganglia really are the origin of the brain. The nerve cells that came together for a purpose eventually became, well, the one in the head became the boss of the whole system, the ganglia that gave rise to the brain. And they're pointing out the nerve cord. In true fashion, as soon as I saw it, I began to talk about it. Right? There's that nerve cord running I'll just draw it here in blue so you don't miss it. Running along here, helping coordinate. If you think about it, here's largely your sensory area. Move this down a little bit. The eyes is a sensory organ. Your antennae for sensing, and then those become not only sense organs, but you send a message to the brain, becomes the response center, and tells the body what to do. Well, that's brilliant. This is evolution. This is why we became multicellular. Pointing out the ganglia. Okay, I don't think there's anything new or missing about that. If you look at where the ganglia are, if there's a lot to coordinate, did you notice the ganglia were right by the individual legs? And then there's also the wings that the ganglia help to, we like to say innervate. Your muscles are innervated. Our fingers can be used to perform surgery on another human being, on animals, to play the piano. Sending out not just nerves, but nerve ganglia to help coordinate response was a very smart prospect indeed. So we like those groups of nerve cells called ganglia. The eyes of the arthropods are kind of interesting. Zoom in a little bit here. It doesn't really do it justice. It's a compound eye. Now I'll draw it a little bit, but I'll pop out to a picture. The eye itself is kind of like a stained glass window, where it's made up of many facets, like little plates. And those facets, if you ever look through a stained glass window, remember that you only see one picture, but it's broken up into little chunks. This is a very good eye. We say it's compound because it's got so many of those little crystal facets. It's good at detecting motion. If you go to swat these guys with a newspaper, it's like a reflection or an image, portion of the images in every single one, and it kind of accentuates motion. If you've ever tried to catch a grasshopper, they're always just one step ahead of you. Let's look at the compound eye. There we go. So once you zoom in and you take a look, it's quite the structure leading to the rods and the cones, because they do see color. In fact, a lot of insects can see past purple. We call that ultraviolet, and they see some colors we don't. The message still leads back to the brain. But my oh my, have they ever got an interesting sort of structure. These little barbs coming out, helping to hold the crystal facets separate from one another. Just unbelievable stuff. This is very different than the eye that you or I possess. I mean, our eye is definitely not multifaceted, right? We have a complex eye, but we don't have a compound eye that does this kind of thing. And colors that insects see, when you look at flowers, for example, they see them very differently than we do, because they're looking for, here it is, because they can see in the ultraviolet spectrum. And this flower on the right, the way they're seeing it, has more or less, the petals are really nice, but the petals are pointing in towards the reproductive part of the flower and sort of telling the insect, this is probably where you want to go, this is where the food source is. So you have to think about this for a moment. The plants are communicating with the insects in a way to let them know where the nectar or the pollen are, so that the insect will be more effective in getting those things. And plants want insects to be successful because we've all seen the bee movie, I hope. The insects help to pollinate the plants. They help plants with their reproductive cycle. We'll get into that more in plants, but that's the idea. So many lenses, very cool. Oh, I should point out before I go too far, there is some insects will have a simple eye. They'll have a little small one there as well, called an ocellus. Come on. If they have more than one, we call it ocelli or ocelli, and those are sort of like light detectors. So they can not only have a compound eye, but some of these arthropods, I should say, will have a simple eye, which also helps them with light detection. Just a little extra help. Okay, so what do they have for a skeletal or locomotory system? I mean, muscular, locomotory. Well, they do have muscles, and these muscles are pretty well coordinated with the nervous system. And we saw the ganglia pretty well at every single leg, and going right to the where the wings might emerge. They have really good leverage, as it turns out. A muscle can only do a push or a pull, and muscles are contracting against the exoskeleton. Now, with us, our muscles, like when you lift something with your hand, right? The weight in your hand gets lifted towards your shoulder by your bicep, and the muscle is, as it contracts, is using its connections to the bones to do that, right? Your forearm and your upper arm. That's a little bit different in insects. They do the exact same thing. It's just that they're not connecting to a bone in the middle. Rather, what they're doing here is they're connecting. So as this muscle here contracts and gets shorter, because that's all muscles can really do, they contract when they're flexed, they'll pull this, let's say that's kind of like your forearm, a little bit closer, right? And then when they relax and the muscle gets longer, oops, as you see down here, here's the muscle, much longer. It's not balled up like a bicep like we saw there. And once it relaxes, it's not exerting force to keep the, let's say, upper arm close. So you have an extension. Not much different than us. The difference is we wouldn't be hooking onto the outside of the bone. We'd be hooking on to from one bone to another. Think of their bones as being on the outside, and think of their bones as being made out of carbohydrate known as chitin. Pretty cool. They have excellent leverage, and if you're wondering if they're very strong, well, I remember you think of what an ant can lift over its head. That's far exceeds its own body weight. So their system's probably a lot better than ours, right? Peter Parker got bit by a radioactive arachnid. It's a good thing it wasn't the other way around, or the poor spider would be quite weak. All the strength of Peter Parker? I don't think so. Reproduction. I remember this topic at university was really quite neat. These arthropods, especially the ones that are on land, will do internal fertilization. Now, some insects, when they mate, may actually have geometric mating devices. Think of it this way. Think of a geometric penis. Try not to make you blush, but if this was the male's genitalia, then this particular insect would only be able to mate. Could mate with that one. Could mate with that one. Oh, wait a minute. Could mate with this one. So a way of having species relative specificity for mating. Yep. So internal fertilization is totally fair game, and yes, they do that. The male deposits the sperm inside the female. That's the definition of internal fertilization. And she lays the eggs, and the process goes around and around. Now, if you're in the water, it's not quite the same thing. Maybe you could do internal fertilization. That's fine. But if you look at natural history, external fertilization is a little bit like the shotgun strategy, where the eggs are released from the female, or she has them close by, and then the sperm is just released into the water, and we have what would be called external fertilization. It's a little bit inaccurate, right? Not every sperm makes it to an egg, we get the idea, but the sperm can certainly swim through water. It's not so tough. On land, you really want to deliver the sperm straight to the female because there's no liquid to swim through per se, right? So maybe direct delivery is a little smarter. As an arthropod gets too big, if you're inside, let's say you're inside of your arthropod exoskeleton, as you begin to grow, that becomes a little bit of an issue because you're right up against the edges of the container. What has to happen is that you need to shed that container. So you produce, and you'll see this with spiders, they're really a good example of it. Enzymes work over the edge of the container, and that container itself becomes soft, and the critter starts to grow a new container and emerge from it. So this outer one breaks down, and when our friend comes out again, he can be full-sized, and then his new external skin begins to harden. So if you look at a molting spider, they do this. I don't think they show one here. Oh, they do. Here it comes. It's called molting. This slide just in words just presents what I was saying. They have to go through sort of a hormonal phase and they can't just shed part of it, but it's got to be the entire exoskeleton, and a new one comes in its place. It's kind of growing underneath the old one. We call this molting. It makes them very vulnerable because think of that armor they have on the outside. It's hard. You can't just biting into them. It's not simple. Some crabs are so hard. I mean, we have to crack them with special little crunching devices. It's funny that they mentioned endocrine system here about this, but let's just say that this is a sort of a hormone rush. Because that's what at this point in grade 11 you should know the endocrine system to be. Your endocrine system, you're going through a hormonal rush right up to about the age of 17. It's very active. But the arthropods, theirs is active every time they have to molt. And that soft shell, it's a bit of an issue. Let's just see. I just want to peek ahead. Nah, they didn't do a good job of showing molting. So, spider molting. Okay, so when a spider molts, images would be fine. We don't really need a lot for this. You'll see it often with something like, let's see, like a tarantula. I'm going to get a little more specific. Not just a spider, but a tarantula. Because they're so big. All right. So when they go to molt, you'll notice there'd be sort of a color change. Something's going on underneath the skin, and the spider will begin to molt, and in this case, emerge from their old, trying to get a good one here, from their old shell, and here he is. He's starting to climb out from his old skin, and when he comes out, the exoskeleton begins to harden again on exposure to the air. So it's a molting process, and at this time, they are very susceptible to predation. There's a really good shot. So they'll sort of sneak off into a corner or someplace where they don't think they'll be caught to go through their molting process. But it is kind of like their Achilles heel, right? It's their vulnerable time. And they leave behind that carbohydrate-like exoskeleton. That's basically ball game. Okay, folks. Well, this has been 28.1. Arthropods is a really big section. I think it goes all the way to 28.4 if I'm not mistaken. So that's it for 28.1. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know. Hasta luego.